Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending this webinar with Dr. Priya Basu. My name is Pat Bono, president of the New York Bee Wellness, which is an independent, educational, grassroots 501c non-membership organization. Its mission is to educate small-scale, sideliner, and beginning beekeepers. We do have a YouTube site with past in-person and online presentations. New York Bee Wellness also sends out newsletters several times a year, and we conduct statewide surveys twice a year for non-migratory beekeepers in New York State. Welcome, Priya. Glad to have you present this evening. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pat, for the invitation, and thank you everyone for joining me today. I am going to quickly go ahead and share my screen with you. Today I am going to talk a little bit about the basics of bee nutrition, but primarily how this fits into our concept of supplemental feeding for hives. And I will also discuss the Honeybee supplemental feeding guide that we recently published from Honeybee Health Coalition. So when we talk about the different stressors that are affecting bees, this is what essentially we are looking at. We have pests, parasites, pathogens, poor nutrition, pesticides, climate change, diseases, whatnot, essentially. So all of these stressors are either acting alone or they are acting in synergy with each other to cause further stress. And this is what primarily our lab we look into. So we not only investigate, for example, the nutrients that are available in the landscape and how they shape bee health, we also study the impacts of pesticides on bees that are in the landscape. We are also looking at climate change and how they affect bees. And as I mentioned before, we study all of these stressors individually. We are also looking at their synergistic impacts, their additive effects, and what can we do to mitigate such stress. So, no matter what research direction we investigate, we are looking at individual bees, but we are also looking at it from the whole colony perspective. And this is why this concept of bee nutrition becomes very important for us. So, when we are talking about nutrition, this concept for honeybees is very similar to what we think about from the human perspective. But there are very important changes. This is because honeybee nutrition is extremely complex. We are looking at colony needs, we are looking at individual needs. What are the castes? What are the ages of the bees that we are considering? So, all of these multifaceted questions come into play when we are looking at this concept of bee nutrition. Especially for bee colonies, nutrition is the first line of defense. Studies have shown that adequate nutrition it helps improve bee health. So colonies which have access to natural forage perform much better. Also, colonies that are well fed, bees have they have longer lifespan, they have better immune system. They are also able to fight off other stressors better. And we all know that in a honeybee colony, nutrition also determines the castes. So if a female larva is fed royal jelly throughout its larval phase, that female larva becomes a queen. If that female larva is switched to a worker diet, which is the brood food, after first 3 days as a larva, she becomes a worker. So essentially, nutrition also has a very critical role to play in caste decision. And thereby, when we are talking about larval nutrition, we have to think about the different castes and how well fed these individual bees are. But most importantly, when we are talking about nutritional stress, it is an important factor in colony losses. Yet, it is not thoroughly investigated. It is only for the last few years that we are actually digging deep into this concept of poor nutrition and how can optimal nutrition help improve bee health. So when we talk about the nutrients that bees require, we can broadly categorize them as macronutrients and micronutrients. Macronutrients, as the name suggests, are of course critical for bees and they are required in large amounts. Examples include major lipids, proteins, and carbohydrates. Micronutrients, on the other hand, are equally important, even though they are required in smaller amounts. And examples of micronutrients include phytochemicals, vitamins, minerals, and phytosterols. And this is what we must acknowledge, that both macro and micronutrients are equally important, even though their quantities may vary for honeybee nutrition and what goes up into making a bee's diet. So during any uh, I would say, a foraging event, a forager honeybee, a worker honeybee who's flying out to look for pollen or nectar or water, she will commit to any one of these resources and she is going to scour the landscape looking for it. So pollen is often collected, and a colony having about 20,000 honeybees approximately collects about 125 pounds of pollen annually. Nectar is also often collected by the colony. So a worker bee, it's estimated that it needs about 11 milligrams of dry sugar per day, and a colony with 50,000 bees require approximately 700 pounds of sugar per year. So you can imagine if that colony was to solely sustain on floral nectar, a flower on an average has less than 50% of sugar concentration in its nectar. So you can imagine the sheer volume of flowers that the bees need to visit just to be able to meet their nutritional demands. And then, of course, water is also required, especially during very dry and hot summers when there is nothing else in bloom. Foragers require water not only for cooling and hydration, they also prefer compound rich water that have more minerals, especially during pollen scarcity. So this video that you see here, I'll talk more about it. It is actually at our on-campus research apiary, and we let this run through summer months when we know that it is extremely dry and hot in the surrounding habitat. So focusing on pollen, we know that pollen provides the proteins that honeybee colonies need for growth. Pollen also has lipids, vitamins, and minerals. And the protein content in flowers, in pollen, it can range anywhere between 2.5 to 61% as per dry diet weight. Pollen is utilized pretty well in the colony. So a pollen forager, she goes out, she collects pollen, stores it on her hind legs while she's flying back. She's going to then come back to the colony, store it in the colony as bee bread. The nurse honeybees, they are consuming this. They have very hyperactive brood food producing glands, and they are provisioning the larva with brood food after feeding on this pollen. So if you remember, I talked about queen nutrition. If you imagine this particular head to be a representation of a worker honeybee, a young nurse honeybee, her head, we are looking at the hypopharyngeal glands around the head region, and these are responsible for producing much of the protein that is found in the royal jelly that is fed to the queen larva. And then right here is the mandibular glands that are responsible for producing the lipid fraction of the royal jelly. So these two glands together help produce the diet, the jelly that the queen larva eats. Moving on to nectar. Nectar obviously is very important because it mainly provides bees with carbohydrates, which are sucrose mostly. But nectar, in addition, also contains phytochemicals, which has phenols, flavonoids, and alkaloids, for example. It also contains minerals. It is said that the darker the color of the honey, the more the mineral content of the floral nectar that the honey is made from. So nectar certainly has a lot more to offer than just carbohydrates. Nectar is eventually converted to honey in the colony, and it is stored like that in capped cells until the bees are ready to eat it, or we as humans, beekeepers, we harvest it for eating or for selling the honey. Some examples of high nectar quantity flowers are, for example, alfalfa, sweet clover, canola. Low nectar quantity flowers are watermelon and some hybrid ornamental plants. And then there are some plants which hardly produce any nectar. Examples include drought stress plants and wind pollinated plants. Lipids are another pillar to the macronutrients that bees require. However, lipids are still under investigated. Lipids can range anywhere between 1 to 20% in plant pollen, and studies have shown that some groups of lipids, such as omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids, they are important to improve honeybee olfactory memory. So their sense of smell, the memory of this smell and their ability to smell, that memory is improved by adding more omega-3 and omega-6 to bee diets. What you see here side by side are two bees. The first is a forager to your left, and then to your right is a nurse bee. If you look at the nurse bee, you see this white cloudy mass in this cross section of her abdomen. This is the fat body. This fat body is a nutrient-rich vital organ that is present near the cuticle of both the adult and the immature honeybees. This fat body that you're seeing here, it serves as a central nutrient storage facility for both the synthesis and the utilization of energy reserves. As you can clearly see, nurse honeybees have dense fat bodies compared with foragers. When that colony is ready to overwinter, some of these overwintering workers, if you actually dissect them, you might see that they are also storing their excess nutrients in their bodies, especially in the fat body region. So while the foragers are super lean and the nurses have these dense fat bodies, the overwintering workers should be somewhere between them, if not resemble the nurses completely. Because these workers, they really need to be able to store all the nutrients in their fat bodies to be able to overwinter. Just like proteins, carbohydrates, and major lipids, which are important macronutrients, we should also remember that micronutrients are equally important. One such micronutrient is phytosterol. Phytosterol, as the name suggests, they are sterols that come from plants, that originate from plants. So us as animals, we have cholesterol. Plants produce phytosterols. So why are phytosterols, even though they are micronutrients, this important? This is because insects, they cannot synthesize their own sterols. And we call all insects, including bees, sterol auxotrophs, which essentially means that they are dependent on their diets to be able to source these sterols. Sterols are very important because they are components of cellular membranes, so they're actually strengthening our individual body cells. But for insects, especially, they are precursors for important hormones, such as molting hormones. When we talk about phytosterols and bees, each bee species has a different sterol need. Honeybees, particularly, they need this very specific phytosterol called 24-methylene cholesterol. Let me show you this quick animation video to talk about why this particular sterol is important. So if you're looking at pollen, pollen naturally has an abundance of phytosterol. Imagine these pink dots. So when these young worker honeybees, the nurses, they are consuming pollen, they're also selectively taking up these phytosterols and they're storing it within their body tissues as endogenous sterols. These sterols are then passed on to the growing larva through brood food. So now the larvae have sterols, they can produce molting hormones, and you see new generations of bees. Imagine an artificial diet which may not contain sufficient phytosterols. So even if the bees are consuming these diets, after a point of time, there are no new sterols to replace these endogenous sterols within the bee tissues. As a result, no sterols going into the growing larva through brood food, no molting hormones, and that is where we see this capping. So essentially, even though these sterols are important micronutrients, uh, they are required in small amounts, we have to make sure that bees have access to this entire range of all the nutrients that they need. So we are doing a lot of studies with these phytosterols. We are adding them in different quantities to artificial diets. We are following them in field and in lab, and we are seeing a lot of important changes, improvements in bee health and physiology, and as well as overall colony health. And what we have seen is that if you're looking at a bee diet, 0.5% dry diet weight of this particular sterol is a good number to start building on. And as I mentioned before, water is equally important. Bees need water to stay cool, to stay hydrated. Also, they may need water to reliquefy crystallized honey. So essentially, water is essential, especially if pollen is absent in the landscape, bees will look for mineral-rich water. You might find them on bird baths, you might find them on puddles, and as you can see, we let this water fountain run through the summer months, and if you can see the tents behind, that's where our research apiary is located. Essentially, we don't clean the water fountain through summer, so we let anything that wants to grow on it, but we do have a gentle running flow of water to avoid mosquito larvae from growing in that water. So when we talk about the major nutritional challenges that honeybees are facing, these are some ways. For example, bees can have an absence of a massive quantity of pollen that is coming into the colony. So they may only get little bits of pollen every now and then. So there is a lack of pollen abundance in the landscape. There can also be a lack of pollen diversity, just like our diet. If you're thinking about the human diet, we need to eat different types of proteins, vegetables, fruits, for example. Similarly, the bees' diet also need to be diverse. Different flowers have different macro and micronutrients. So the diverse the diet, the diverse the nutrients that the bees have access to. And a lack thereof will mean nutritional stress. There can also be a lack of pollen quality. Some of our studies, for example, have shown that plants such as hybrid carrot seeds, their pollen is not as nutritionally optimal as, for example, apples or pears or cherries. So there can also be a lack of pollen quality. Even though the bees have access to pollen, it is not of a very high quality. And let us not forget nectar. Nectar is their main source of energy, carbohydrates, and nectar also has more nutrients to offer. So, an insufficient nectar flow in the landscape can also be a major nutritional challenge. At the end of the year, overwintering survival is very important for the colony. So, we need to make sure that the colony has enough food reserves stored within the hive, and the overwintering workers also have enough food stored within their body tissues to be able to last these winter months and help rear the new generation of brood the following spring. So, a quick check of the frames can always tell us what is available in the landscape and what are bees bringing in. To your left, you can see the capped honey, and to your right, you can see this beautiful brand of multicolored bee bread, which tells us that bees have access to diverse types of pollen in the landscape. And then, of course, you also see this nice little band of honey all around it. If you look at these pictures, the one to your left shows you what well-nourished larvae should look like, and the one to your right shows you what starved larvae look like. So essentially, if you look at the picture to your left, this is what we are aiming for. These white, healthy, puffy larvae, they are floating in these luscious pools of brood food. And to your right, you see that the very larvae, they are very dry, and this tells you that they are definitely being starved. So essentially, when you're looking at it from a colony perspective, this is what we are trying to avoid. Bees that have starved over winters, they did not have enough food reserves in the colony to help last them the winter months. Essentially, to sum this up, everything that a bee needs is present in this flower, in its pollen, in its nectar. We need to be able to provide bees with a diverse habitat because diverse habitat have diverse nutrients. Staggered bloom is obviously even more helpful. Something or the other is constantly blooming in the landscape throughout the year. I can give you an example. For example, with our lab, where our research apiary is located on campus, we have a pollinator garden that has been planted alongside with it. And we plan ahead and we plant ahead so that there are always some plants that are blooming throughout the year, especially during the hot and dry summer months when the bees will have difficulty scouring for pollen and nectar in the landscape. So having access to a staggered bloom means that they will obviously be able to source some pollen, some nectar from their landscape. And of course, abundant forage is also equally important. So we do know that diverse forage is important because in reality, whatever artificial diet that we're providing to the colonies, as of now, they cannot truly replace natural pollen. Pollen obviously has a lot more macro and micronutrients that we have available in these artificial diets. Similarly, sugar syrup alone cannot replace nectar. Nectar also has macro and micronutrients that it provides to the colony. But as important as diverse forage is, so is supplemental feeding. We cannot let the colony starve. If they do not have access to natural forage, then we need to be able to provide them supplemental feeding either through protein supplements or as carbohydrate supplements. And to have a better understanding how to provide supplemental feeding to the colonies, we recently published this review and guide to providing supplemental feeding to honeybee colonies. This has been published through Honeybee Health Coalition, and I am going to focus a little bit on this guide towards the second half of my talk today. So this guide, if you look at the table of contents, it basically goes through the basics of bee nutrition, and then it talks about what are the different ways that you can feed a colony. Honestly, this is one of my favorite comic graphics that I found online, related to beekeepers and beekeeping. This obviously does not sum up everything that goes on your mind when you're thinking about bees and how to help keep your colonies healthy and alive. Beekeepers have to deal with so many problems. On top of that, making sure that the colonies are well nourished is another added problem. If you actually look at this recent NAS statistics from 2023, this tells you about the income and expenditure of the beekeepers across the US in 2021 and 2022. This little part that I've highlighted shows you feed. So the amount of dollars that beekeepers have spent in the US for providing supplemental feeding to honeybee colonies, which can include syrup, sugar water, honey, pollen patties, and basically any type of supplemental feeding. And if you look at the values, that is frightening. Feeding a colony is the most expensive expenditure for a beekeeper, followed by varroa mites control and treatment. However, that doesn't even come close to how much beekeepers are spending annually to making sure that their colonies are well fed. And there was obviously a need to provide better information to the beekeepers about supplemental feeding, but also making sure all of that information came to this one place. With that in mind, Project 8%, Honeybee Health Coalition, and we got together along with the technical review committee, and we had all of these experts going over what are the needs, what can we do to address them. And that is when we came out with this supplemental feeding guide. So if you look at your screen, I have posted a QR code to the left of your screen. If you want, you can pull out your cell phone, just zoom into this QR code, and this link will take you directly to the supplemental feeding guide that is available online and freely. I will be going a little bit through this nutrition guide in the next few slides. So if you want, you can follow me while looking at the guide or just directly on my slides. So essentially, this supplemental feeding guide, it is one place for information and summary. So we want all beekeepers, whether you're a beginner beekeeper or an experienced beekeeper, we want to be able to provide all that information and the summary of what we know, what science tells us, and what beekeepers know, all in this one place. The technical value of the guide, especially for beginner beekeepers, is obviously massive. And most importantly, towards the end of the guide, we have these case studies. Real life beekeeper interviews commercial beekeepers across the US with different types of beekeeping practice. So if suppose I'm a queen breeder and I would like to switch to becoming a honey producer, what does a typical commercial honey producer do throughout the year? How is he managing his colonies? So these are some of the things that the guide looks into. So the guide specifically focuses on proteins individually as well as on carbohydrate supplemental feeding. We also talk about how protein patties that are available in the market can either be pollen supplements, so these have some pollen added to these protein patties, or they can be pollen substitutes, where it's a completely artificial diet and it has no pollen added. These commercial protein diets, they can either be in a ready-to-use patty form that we more often tend to buy, or they can also be sold as dry formulations. Beekeepers tend to use these dry formulations directly, or there might be additional instructions on how to make a patty. We also must remember that the size of the pollen substitute or the pollen supplement patty is very important. If our colony is rapidly growing, especially when natural forage is limited and we are giving them a small quantity of the paddy, this will hinder colony growth. On the other hand, for example, I am here in the southeast and we have a severe problem with small hive beetles. So if we were to give a giant patty, this leftover unconsumed patty can not only attract small hive beetles, but also other pests and mold. So depending on what region we are in, and what are the needs of the colony, how well they are feeding, that size of the pollen patty or the protein patty, it becomes very important. As a part of this guide, we also discussed how are the different ways we can provide supplemental sugar feeding to the colonies for a beginner beekeeper versus what a large scale commercial beekeeper would feed. So what are the pros and what are the cons of the different types of feeding methods? If you have the guide open, feel free to look at it, but I have just summarized some tables here for you. We do not have to read the entire table today, but just know that these tables are also available in that guide. So what we have done here is that we have provided a couple of tables where we have summarized information from different beekeepers on how to provide supplemental feeding as a general recommendation for proteins and for carbohydrates. So this, what we are looking at, is suggested protein feeding. So for example, if we are starting a package or a hive which has no foundation, we are not even going to go into proteins. We are first going to feed sugar supplementation. If our colony is building up during spring, we can feed proteins to stimulate brood production. And this colony stimulation is only desirable when natural forage is available. So we must remember that a pollen supplement patty is often favored over a pollen substitute patty, obviously because it has some degree of natural pollen in it. And this colony can be stressed if the population is rapidly expanding, there is a scarcity of natural forage, and you stop feeding. So if we start feeding, we cannot stop feeding unless we know that natural forage is available in abundance and the bees have access to it. During summer, mostly for colony maintenance, protein feeding is not suggested or recommended unless that colony is rapidly and unusually expanding. Late summer, early fall is when the colony is now ready to start overwintering. They are securing as many food resources as possible. They are storing everything in the hive. So pollen substitute fat, these paddies, they can help fatten up the colony and they can be fed to bolster these overwintering honeybees or the diutinous honeybees. And in winter, unless you're way down in the south, and you do not necessarily have a brood break, there is really no need to provide any supplemental protein feeding to these colonies. Similarly, you can trap for pollen during favorable forage conditions to feed the colonies when they need it. So I will talk a little bit about this towards the end of my slide, towards the end of my presentation. But what I often do is in my research apiary, I know during which time of the year the bees are bringing in a ton of pollen. I do not starve one hive particularly. I switch out these pollen traps between strong colonies 48 hours at a time, and I trap for a ton of pollen. I freeze it in my lab, and then I add it back to the paddies that we feed them during the rest of the year when we know that they do not have access to natural pollen forage. Buying pollen commercially, natural bee, these corbicular pollen commercially can not only be very expensive, you always also have to worry about, am I bringing in any diseases? Am I bringing in any pesticide exposure through these pollen? So one way you can look at it is that this is the pollen your colony would have anyhow brought and would have had access to. So all you're doing is that you're just freezing it for a few months and then you're adding it back to the colony during times of forage dearth. Moving on to the sugar supplemental feeding recommendations. Whenever we are starting a package or a hive which has no foundation, we need to continue feeding one-to-one sugar syrup. Some beekeepers like to constantly feed until they have all fully drawn combs, or at least the brood boxes have all fully drawn combs. But it obviously depends on the beekeeper needs, the beekeeper budget, and also how the colony is responding in that particular region in that season. In spring buildup, as I mentioned before, do not stop feeding before the main honey flow uh, because your colony can starve. And also, you must stop feeding once the honey flow kicks in to avoid any honey adulteration. If you're queen rearing, you can also feed a small quantity of one-to-one sugar syrup every few days to help the cell builders and the queen banks. In summer, if there is a nectar dearth where you're located, one-to-one sugar supplementation is very critical for colony functioning. In fall, usually a thicker 2-to-1 ratio is provided because it is easier to ripen by the honeybees, so they do not have to spend a lot of energy in fall right before going into winter to be able to store this sugar syrup. And in winter months, our main goal should be that that colony has enough honey left to be able to sustain the entire overwintering period. So our main purpose is to make sure that the colony has enough food. If for some reason we are worried that we have not left enough food or it has become warmer and we are worried that the bees might eat faster and finish what they have, we can occasionally check the colonies depending on where we are and if the weather permits. If we really have to provide supplemental feeding, sugar feeding in winter, generally uh, it is recommended as a dry formulation as either a fondant or granulated sugar. But we must remember that only stronger colonies can forage for water to reliquefy these dry sugars, and weaker colonies will not be strong enough to forage. So the goal is to make sure that before these colonies are overwintering, they are strong colonies and they have enough food. How much honey we need to leave in our boxes, in our colonies, the best resource would always be your local experienced beekeeper because they have been doing this for decades and they can tell you, depending on the size of your colony, what it looks like and the region you are in, how much honey you should ideally leave in your colonies. The guide also touches a little bit about prebiotics and probiotics. And our lab, we also do a lot of work on honeybee gut microbiome, also examining the impacts of commercial probiotics. So I really thought that I should add a little subsection on top, basically how we feed probiotics to the bees and if there is any information available on their effectiveness. So probiotics, they are a mixture of living microorganisms, and prebiotics are the food, the substrate that promote the growth of these microorganisms, these bacteria and yeast. There is still limited understanding and a lack of peer-reviewed research regarding the beneficial effects of the commercial probiotics that are sold in the US and in other countries. In fact, there was a recent paper by Dr. Kirk Anderson and his team that actually showed a negative effect. So there are mixed results and it is really difficult because at this point, there is very limited understanding and we do not have enough scientific research to understand what are the beneficial effects of these commercial probiotics. And research also shows that these probiotics that are sold commercially, the bacteria that are present there, they fail to establish in bee guts. Whereas if there are researchers who are specifically looking at culturing strains from the honeybee guts like lactobacillus, they are feeding bees with these individual bacterium and they are finding that these bacterium that are cultured from the honeybee guts themselves, they are able to establish better. So just a quick recap, this is what we are trying to avoid. on a colony level, on an individual level. If you're looking at the adults, if you're looking at the larva, it does not matter. This is what we are trying to avoid. We are trying to prevent malnourished colonies because our colony must be well fed throughout the year, especially when they are overwintering. So going back to the bee nutrition guide, I have the QR code pulled up to the left once more. And this little section that I've highlighted, this is towards the end of the guide. We have 3 appendices. The first is a table summary of all the information that is available out there, scientifically published papers, peer-reviewed literature that talks about these different commercial supplements. Do they have any beneficial effects? Do they have any negative effects? Or there are no effects really? They make no difference. So what does research tell us? Those are summarized in this table. Then we have in Appendix B, the different beekeeper interviews that I talked about. So these are real life case studies from commercial beekeepers across the US, across different beekeeping practices. So this set of interviews, it really helps us see that how different beekeepers nutritionally manage their colonies depending on where they're located, what are their beekeeping practice needs, and what are the colony needs. And at the very end, I've also listed in Appendix C further reading references if you would like to go and look at other additional reading papers. So there are some questions I am often asked, and today actually a set of questions was forwarded to me by Pat, very similar to what beekeepers often ask me when I talk about the supplemental feeding guide. The first question is, do honeybees store these artificial diets in their hives? This is a very good paper from Dr. Jamie Ellis's lab out of University of Florida if you're interested in reading up about it. Their study actually showed that only a proportion of the adult bees, they are eating this artificial diet that is provided to the colony. These bees, they do not feed the larvae this artificial diet directly. So no larva is fed the commercial diet directly. They also found that the adult worker bees, they are not storing this artificial diet in the colony like they would with pollen. We know that pollen is stored as bee bread, but adult bees, they do not store these artificial diets like they do with bee bread. And only a small proportion of the paddy is lost as debris. So essentially, the bees are eating it, but they are not directly providing it to the larvae, and they're also not storing it. So it might provide some temporary short-term relief for protein needs for the adults, but it may not necessarily translate for larval growth over a long period of time. Then the other question that I get is often beekeepers asking me, are there any benefits of adding liquid supplements to sugar syrup? So we know that there are a lot of products that are available in the market where we can use it as an additive to sugar syrup. And if you read the guide, there is a section that touches upon this exact same question. There is no peer-reviewed research yet about adding any of these supplements to sugar syrup. Some beekeepers say that, adding these liquid supplements to the syrup, it actually makes the feed more attractive. But we must remember that we should not do it during robbing seasons because we are only going to encourage more robbing of the weaker colonies by the stronger colonies. And another thing that I always talk about when I come to addressing this question is that a plant may be attractive. So say lavender, for example, we know that lavender flower is very attractive to bees for its pollen, its nectar, whatever the flower has to offer to the bees. But does that really translate to the essential oil? The essential oil might smell good, might make the sugar syrup attractive, but what nutritional value does it really have? We know that thymol, for example, as an essential oil, it has some mitoside property. But when you're looking at it from a nutrition perspective, does it have the required nutrients that bees need? In what amounts? We must remember that palatability, digestibility, and assimilation are not the same things. And I also mentioned this in the bee nutrition guide. Just because something is palatable and the bees are readily eating it does not mean that the bees can digest it. It also does not mean that the bee is able to metabolize it and source out all the nutrients that it needs from that and assimilate it within their body tissues. So a lot of it actually is very different. So when we are looking at a bee diet, we have to consider all of these questions before we start looking into their benefit. And another question that I'm often asked is how to best provide honeybee colonies with the curbicular pollen that we trap ourselves. So if you remember, I mentioned that we often trap pollen in our research apiary, and then I feed it back to the colonies during times of pollen dearth. So the way I often do it is I just make my own paddy. This is not the best example. I got this question, or rather I read it pretty late in the day, so I couldn't find the picture that I wanted. But what you're seeing is a small picture of a lab cage. So we run a lot of lab cage studies along with field studies, and this is a pollen paddy that I made with sugar syrup that I gave to the bees for feeding. And the research questions were very different. But essentially, a large paddy can also look like this. So what we do is we just mix sugar syrup into our paddy and we give it to the bees. Another way we do it is that we mix this pollen into any artificial diet that we are going to feed to the colonies. So we don't have to start from scratch. We just make a thin paste of the pollen with sugar syrup and we mix it into the paddy that we're feeding to the colonies. And then there are some beekeepers who also prefer pressing it down into the drawn frames and putting it into the colony as a packed sort of a bee bread frame. So there are many ways that you can do it. You can also, if you have enough bee bread in some frames and you know that your colony is not going to starve, you can also freeze the whole frame and give it back to the colony. But essentially, if we are trapping for pollen, and I talk about this in the guide, please make sure that the same colony is not being starved over a prolonged period of time. I usually trap for 48 hours at a time during bright sunny days when I know that the bees are bringing in a ton of pollen, and I switch out the pollen traps between different strong colonies. So with that, I am going to end by briefly introducing my lab to you. We have an amazing group of graduate students and research associates who are extremely passionate about bee research, and they study bees on a wide variety of research questions, all the way from looking at the interactions between pesticides and nutrition, diseases, gut microbiome, climate change, and whatnot. I also have an amazing group of undergraduate students. Some of them have graduated, some of them are still in our lab, but they are truly our wondergrads. They are the strength of the hive, and they help us work on these millions of samples that we have or the different research projects that we have. And a lot of them are deeply involved with bee nutrition research we conduct in our lab. I would like to thank you for inviting me to come and speak today. I would also like to thank everyone who signed up and who are present today in this evening to hear me talk a little bit about bee nutrition and the supplemental feeding guide. And obviously, our research and extension partners are stakeholders, collaborators, and funding agencies without whom none of the work that we do is truly possible. With that, I have listed my lab website. So the QR code to the top left will take you to my lab website. We also have a Facebook page if you're interested in following us. I have listed our Twitter handles or X handles and our and my email address. I will be very happy to take any questions now, but we do regularly seek beekeeper volunteers for a number of database projects that we are currently building from the lab for bee nutrition. So if you have any questions about those database projects, if you would like to become a citizen scientist on any of these projects, please do not hesitate to reach out to me. Please send me an email. My email address is right here, and I'll be happy to talk to you. So with that, I am going to stop my screen sharing, and I'll be happy to answer your questions.
Okay, we have several in the Q&A box.
Okay. The first one I see is that are the larvae fed directly bee bread and honey, or is it the nurse bees that eat the bee bread and honey to produce the jelly, and only jelly is fed to the larvae, no matter queen, worker, or drone? Sometimes pollen can also be fed in a little quantity, especially to drone brood, but primarily, as I showed in my slides, it's the nurse bees that are consuming that pollen, and then they're feeding the larvae. The next question is about discussing the status of glyphosate and its impact on bee paddy supplemental feed. Is there a move towards organic non-GMO paddies? That is a great question. I may not be able to completely answer that question today without having uh, researched as to, how uh, what movement is happening. And I see Pat would like to chip in, but all I can say is glyphosate, the main problem with glyphosate would be it takes out any flowering weed or any supplemental forage around a crop more than anything else. But Pat, I thought you wanted to answer this question live. Is it true?
Oh, no, I'm just editing the question.
Okay.
Sorry.
Sorry. But yes, glyphosate, if it is taken up by the pollen, it can be present in the pollen that is being brought back into the colony by the honeybee foragers, and the colony will be consuming it. So what we need to know is how much of that glyphosate is present in that pollen. uh, what is the LD50 value for honeybees? Is it being able to disrupt the honeybee gut microbiome, like some studies have shown? So essentially, the dose will matter. But at this point, I think the first problem with glyphosate would potentially be that it might take away the flowering weed around a particular crop. Are there any suggestions to share about plants that can be grown for all the reasons the bees need them? That is an excellent question. And this actually ties back to what I mentioned about our bee nutrition database. So just to answer your question, our lab is building two bee nutrition databases. The first is looking at pollen nutrition of all bee plants across North America. So we have over 54 citizen scientists across US and Canada who are helping us to build this bee nutrition database. We are looking at pollen proteins, lipids, phytosterols, amino acids, metabolites. So we are looking at a wide range of macro and micronutrients because remember, they are both equally important. So that is what we are hoping to do. Because right now, if you're looking at the bee planting guidelines, we know that they are important in the habitat. Bees are visiting them. They might look great in the landscape for aesthetic purposes. They may grow really well in a particular region in a particular season. But do we really know what is the nutritional quality of these plants that we are planting? So that is what we are hoping to answer. This database will be completely open, freely available, and we can then choose the plants we would like to plant. So we may choose plants that have high sterols, high proteins, or high lipids, or we might choose plants that complement each other very well. And the second bee nutrition database that we are building is creating a phenology wheel. We've started with the Southeast region and now we have expanded nationally. So in this particular project, beekeepers are our volunteers. They are trapping pollen once a month for 12 calendar months in their location. They're sending us the pollen. We are trying to ID those pollen to tell them what is in bloom, where is it blooming. But also, most importantly, we are telling them the nutritional quality of that pollen their bees are bringing back in. So I'm hoping that there will be a better answer to your question in the next few months when we at least start publishing results from the bee nutrition database soon. The next question is, how long can pollen be stored in the hive? Should frames of pollen from last season be removed if not consumed during the winter, early spring? That is a great question. If it is in the hive, the bees will eat it. If they have kept it stored there, they're going to use it for some reason. Uh, I would not generally pull anything out of the hive because that is a natural process. In the lab, though, if I am to trap for pollen and I would like to give it back to the colony, I freeze it only for 3 to 4 months at a time. So I collect it in spring and I would feed it back in peak summer when there is nothing in bloom. The next question is, in late summer, early fall, would supplemental feeding be advisable when the bees are creating winter diutinous bees? Don't these bees need higher fat bodies for overwintering? Excellent question. Yes, supplemental feeding is definitely advisable for late summer, early fall, as I mentioned in my slides, also in the guide, because you are absolutely right. Bees need a lot of food in their colony within their body tissues to be able to overwinter better. They do need higher fat bodies. The next question is, earlier material indicated that feeding pollen paddies can hinder brood growth. Is this for artificial supplement only or does it apply to paddies with real pollen? No, real pollen So feeding protein patties will not hinder brood growth. What it will do is if we are feeding a small quantity to a rapidly growing colony, that will hinder brood growth. So if the colony is eating it all and they're rapidly growing, we need to keep matching that. We need to continue feeding the colony as long as it wants to. If there is natural pollen and nectar available in the landscape, they will prefer that over sugar syrup or an artificial diet. But um, if our bees are undernourished, if there is nothing blooming in the landscape, and we've already started feeding the colony, and we provide them with little feed at a time, or we stop feeding when the colony is rapidly growing, that can hinder brood growth. So the next question is, what do you think of feeding sugar syrup at a feed station versus individual hive? I'm assuming a feed station would be somewhat comparable to what a lot of people do with barrel feeding versus feeding them at individual hive. It honestly depends on a lot of different perspectives. So to just to give, the answer is not simple. Just to give an example, some beekeepers might use barrel feeding because it's allowed in their region, and then there are some states or some counties that ban barrel feeding, barrel or a feed station, because there can be concerns about spread of diseases between colonies. You're also attracting neighboring colonies to your individual feeding station, or you might attract uh, a predatory insect, or you might attract a lot of different things to that feed station. There are also beekeepers who prefer using a feed station to especially during a robbing season when they're working colonies, because they know that this is going to prevent robbing of the weaker colonies. It also helps them work through the apiary faster and with fewer bees at their faces. So really, I mean, it depends a lot on the perspective. Would you like to feed the bees at a feeding station because it is going to attract the bees there more and it's easy for you to work the colony? Do you have the time and the resources to individually fill every colony with the sugar supplement inside the hive? Or is providing sugar syrup at a feeding station easy for you? We also must remember that the weather has to permit, and all of those factors play into which one is better versus the other. So there is another question on any thoughts on microalgae for bee feed. Actually, Dr. Vincent Risigliano from the Baton Rouge USDA Bee Lab, he's doing a lot of research on microalgae for bee feed, and they are finding promising results. They've also published it. So I think reading his papers uh, and having met him and having spoken with him about his research on microalgae, why not? It might actually open up quite an avenue as a supplemental feed for honeybee colonies. So the next question is there any special handling processing to perform on the pollen trapped in your local hives? If I understand your question right, you're probably, I hope I'm understanding the question right, that if I am trapping the pollen in my local hive, what do I do next to freeze it and then give it back to the hives? All I do is I have a chest freezer. I actually have multiple chest freezers for the lab, but I just collect them, put it in the chest freezer, and I add it back to the colony after thawing it out. So there is really nothing special that I do other than making sure that I trap on dry sunny days. And as I mentioned, that I'm looking at the stronger colonies to trap pollen from, and I'm not selectively starving any colony over a prolonged period of time. So I go with 48 hours at a time. And then there are beekeepers in Florida, for example, those who are working with us on the phenology wheel project, they only trap for 24 hours, actually from morning till sunset, because in way down in South Florida, it is so humid. Even if it does not rain, you cannot leave pollen out in the trap. So a lot of it will also depend on the day, on your particular weather conditions. The last question that I see online is that they have a problem with comb stored pollen tends to mold in hive during the middle of winter. Suggestions beside more ventilation, they don't have a big freezer to store pollen. If you mold is a problem. And I'm based in Mississippi right now, so sometimes we might see that if the winter is very moist, and we tend to have a lot of humidity, and especially if it's warm and humid during the winter months. To be very honest, all I have done is I have found it, I have cleaned it out, and I that's the best I do, other than providing ventilation, because I do not know of a product that can be safely added to the stored pollen to prevent it from forming mold. So if the bees have already stored that in their colony, they thought that they were going to eat it, and if they have not ate it, or if there is mold for some other reasons, I would also check if there is anything else that is happening to the colony which might contribute to the mold. But honestly, I just clean it out. If you do not have a big freezer to store pollen, you do not need to store that entire frame. You can also take out the bee bread, or you can also uh, trap for pollen and just put it in a Ziploc bag. We do a combination of both. We use Ziploc bags for collecting pollen and keeping it, or we also use a freezer space for storing bee bread frames. I hope I was able to answer all your questions. And as I mentioned before, please do not hesitate to reach out to me if you have any other questions, or if you would like to participate in any of the citizen scientist projects that we have.
All right.
Thank you
Thank you
so
very
much.
much. Yeah, thank you.